I want to start with something small. Not a pyramid, not a buried city, not a map that shouldn't exist, just a fruit, a tiny, almost absurdly small fruit that until 3 years ago I had never thought to question. I walked past them my entire childhood, in parks, along footpaths, growing from cracks in old stone walls in the kind of European cities that looked like they were dropped whole from another era. Little red things, fragrant, almost impossibly sweet for something no one seemed to grow, no one seemed to sell, and no one seemed to talk about. Wild strawberries, Fragaria vesca. And then I found a Flemish manuscript dated to 1580. One line stopped me completely. A preparation of wild strawberry, it said, was capable of reversing the corruptions of age in the body's humours. Reversing. The corruptions of age. I want you to hold that phrase. Because once I found it, I started looking for where else it appeared. And that's when everything got strange. Not in a government archive, not in a forgotten library, in the grass. Let me tell you what the official history of the wild strawberry looks like, because it's important to establish the baseline before we start pulling at the threads. The wild strawberry, we are told, is a minor woodland plant. Common, weedy even. It spread across the northern hemisphere through ordinary ecological processes and has existed in its current form for thousands of years. It was consumed by various peoples throughout history. It was occasionally mentioned in medieval herbalism, and then eventually it was superseded by the larger commercial hybrid strawberry, Fragaria and Ananassa, developed in 18th century France through a cross between a North American and a Chilean species. And that was that. The wild strawberry became a footnote, a quaint relic, something you might find on a hiking trail if you were lucky. That's the official story. It's tidy, it's logical, and it almost holds together. Almost. This raises a simple but critical question. If the wild strawberry is merely a minor, unremarkable weed, why does it appear with such extraordinary regularity in pre-19th century medical literature as something approaching a cure? Not a garnish, not a flavouring, a medicine. Because 3 years ago, researching 19th century urban parks for a completely unrelated project, I started finding something I couldn't explain. In survey after survey, London's Regent's Park, the Bois de Boulogne, the Prater in Vienna, Gorky Park in Moscow, references to the same removal programme. A coordinated effort to remove Fragaria vesca from public green spaces. Not relocate it, remove it. And the language across every document was almost identical, across cities with no obvious reason to be coordinating. Undesirable understory. Incompatible with modern park management. Why? Because this plant wasn't just a weed someone had decided to tidy away. People had known about this plant for a very, very long time. This isn't a medieval invention. Go back further, much further. The Greeks and Romans believed the wild strawberry could treat melancholy, depression, fevers, inflammation, kidney stones, gout, throat and mouth infections, and diseases of the blood, liver and spleen. Not as folk curiosity, as medicine. Specific medicine for specific conditions. That is a remarkably precise pharmacological profile for something we now treat as a weed. A profile detailed enough that you have to ask, how did they know that? What observation, repeated over what period of time, produced that level of specificity? You don't arrive at kidney stones and diseases of the spleen by accident. You arrive there by watching, by documenting, by treating and observing outcomes across generations. The texts are striking in their consistency. Hildegard von Bingen, writing in 12th century Germany, described the wild strawberry as an agent of what she called viriditas, a Latin word often translated as greenness or vitality, but which she used in a very specific medical context to mean something closer to life force regeneration. Nicholas Culpeper, the 17th century English herbalist whose work we tend to dismiss as pre-scientific folklore, wrote that wild strawberry preparations could restore the complexion and put vigour back into aged blood. and then there is the stone. By the 16th and 17th centuries, stonemasons were carving the wild strawberry into the altars, pillars and doorways of churches and cathedrals across Europe. Not as decoration, as symbol, as doctrine, carved in granite and limestone and meant to last 1,000 years. The strawberry represented perfection and righteousness. It was associated with the healing power of Christ. It was believed specifically to cure depression, the same condition the Greeks had catalogued 15 centuries earlier. Think about what that means architecturally. You don't carve something into a cathedral doorway because it's a pleasant weed you found in the forest. You carve it because it means something, because it does something, because the accumulated weight of centuries of observation has elevated it to the level of the sacred. That's not superstition. That's testimony. An anonymous Flemish medical manuscript from around 1580, housed at the University of Ghent and rarely cited in mainstream botanical history, goes further still, describing a preparation of wild strawberry leaves, roots and fruit taken over an extended period as capable of reversing the corruptions of age in the body's humours, reversing the corruptions of age. That's not typical herbalist language, that's a specific technical claim. And it appears not once, not twice, but in variant forms across dozens of pre-modern European medical texts, across traditions that had limited contact with one another. Here's where I have to ask you to stay with me, because this is where the story gets considerably larger. I want to be careful here. I'm not making claims, I'm presenting patterns and asking why they exist. That distinction matters. When I began looking beyond European sources, I found something that should not, by the logic of isolated cultural development, exist. In traditional Haudenosaunee, the Iroquois Confederacy, medicinal knowledge recorded in the early 18th century by French Jesuit missionaries, there are references to a small forest strawberry preparation used not merely for sustenance but for what the missionaries translated as making the elders young again in their blood. The Jesuit writing this found it ridiculous. He noted it as an example of native superstition and moved on, but the description is there. The specific fruit, small, fragrant, growing without cultivation in forest clearings, is identifiable. In Japan, I found references in Edo period herbalist texts to Nohara Ichigo, the field strawberry, described in the context of longevity practices with a specificity that goes well beyond what you'd expect for a food plant. The text describes specific preparation methods, specific times of harvest, specific combinations with other plants that, intriguingly, appear in some European texts as well. In the Andean traditions documented by Spanish colonial chroniclers, and we should always be suspicious of those chroniclers who had obvious reasons to minimize indigenous knowledge, there are mentions of a small native strawberry, Fragaria kiloensis, used in what the chroniclers called rejuvenation ceremonies. They describe these with contempt, as paganism. But the underlying botanical description is specific. 3 continents, distinct civilizations, no plausible vector of cultural exchange for most of this period, and yet the same fruit, the same claims, the same language around reversal, regeneration, the rolling back of physical deterioration. The evidence suggests something much larger was either known on a world-spanning scale or arrived on a world-spanning scale and was then somehow forgotten on a world-spanning scale. How does that happen? How does a piece of knowledge that appears in Japan, in the Iroquois territories, in Flemish manuscripts and in Andean chronicler accounts simply vanish? If what you've seen so far interests you, consider becoming a YouTube member to support this research. This is where the investigation takes a turn I wasn't prepared for. Let's return to those park management documents because I spent 6 months in archives and I want to share what I found. The timeline of the wild strawberry removal program, and I'm going to keep calling it that, a program because that is what the evidence suggests it was, clusters almost entirely between 1840 and 1920. Not before, not after. Between 1840 and 1920. This is a period with a name in official history. It's called the Great Era of Urban Park Construction, the Olmsted Era in America, the Haussmann Era in France. The period during which the modern concept of the public park was, we are told, invented and installed across the industrializing world. And here's the strangest part. Every single major urban park construction or renovation project I examined from this period included, in its foundational planning documents, language about removing or prohibiting spontaneous self-seeding plants. The language varies by city and by planner, but the effect is consistent. Plants that grew without human intervention, the so-called volunteers in horticultural terminology, were systematically eliminated from these new managed spaces. Wild strawberry was not the only plant affected, but it appears with a regularity that I cannot explain as coincidence. In the original Olmsted documents for Central Park in New York, documents held at the Library of Congress and available to any researcher, there are explicit references to removing spontaneous fruiting understory from the park's meadow sections. Olmsted himself wrote, in a letter to his partner, Calvert Vaux, that the presence of small fruiting plants accessible to the public was, and I'm paraphrasing the spirit of the phrasing here because the originals are available for your own review, incompatible with the park's civilizing function. Incompatible with the civilizing function. Think about that sentence. Think about what it implies about what the park was actually for. The official explanation collapses here if we're being honest. We're told that removing wild plants from urban parks was simply about aesthetics and management, about creating ordered, legible green spaces in chaotic industrial cities. And perhaps that's part of it. Perhaps. But then how do we explain the specificity? How do we explain that across dozens of cities, across London, Paris, Vienna, Berlin, New York, Chicago, and Moscow, the documentation shows not a general prejudice against wild plants, but a recurring specific attention to small fruiting species? And among them, with what I can only describe as an almost ritualistic consistency, the wild strawberry. I'm not saying anyone made a list. I'm asking, what if they didn't have to? This is where the investigation becomes genuinely difficult to explain within the standard framework. Let's be precise about what the coordination problem actually is, because this is important. For the patterns I've described to be coincidental, you would need to believe that municipal planners in London, Paris, Vienna, New York, and Moscow, operating under different political systems in different cultural contexts, speaking different languages with different horticultural traditions, all independently arrived at the same specific conclusions about which plants to remove, using almost identical bureaucratic language within the same 80-year window. Not similar policies, not overlapping aesthetic philosophies, not a shared general trend. The same specific outcomes in the same specific time frame, targeting the same specific plants. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision. Now, I want to be a fair investigator here. There are explanations that don't require anything unusual. International horticultural societies existed in this period. The Royal Horticultural Society in London had connections across Europe and the United States. Ideas did travel, park planners did attend the same conferences and read the same journals. But here's where that explanation runs into trouble. The removal of wild strawberry from urban parks does not appear in the published literature of these horticultural societies. It's not in the conference proceedings I've been able to locate. It's not debated in the journals. It appears in the administrative paperwork of individual parks as if it were already settled policy. Policy that arrived without public discussion, without a recorded moment of decision, and without any stated scientific basis in the documents themselves. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. The silence was deafening. Where is the paper trail for the decision? Where is the Horticultural Society meeting at which someone stood up and said, "The wild strawberry must go"? Where is the scientific study that provided the basis for its removal? Where is the administrator's letter to his superior explaining why this specific plant, which had grown in European public spaces for centuries, suddenly needed to be eliminated? I couldn't find it. Not in London, not in Paris, not in the American records I was able to access. The decision, if it was a decision, appears to have been made somewhere that left no paper trail. And then it was implemented everywhere, more or less simultaneously by people who wrote it into their documents as if it were obvious. This raises a simple but critical question. What did the people making these decisions know that they chose not to write down? I want to add one more layer to this because I think it matters enormously. The period from 1840 to 1920 is not only the period of the urban park construction boom, it is also, and this is in every mainstream history of medicine, the period during which the modern pharmaceutical industry was born. The transition from botanical, plant-based folk medicine to standardized, manufactured, patentable pharmaceutical compounds happens almost entirely within this same 80-year window. I'm not making any claims about what this means. I want to be clear about that. Correlation is not causation, and I am not asserting that these two phenomena are directly connected by deliberate intent. But I am asking, is it possible that something was known about Fragaria vesca, something specific, something physiological, something that fell outside the emerging scientific framework's ability to explain, but that practitioners had observed empirically for centuries, and that this knowledge was quietly retired along with the broader tradition of botanical medicine? The deeper I went into the 19th century medical literature, the literature of the transition period, not the confident scientific medicine of the 20th century, but the messy, contested, negotiated medicine of the 19th, the more references I found to wild strawberry preparations being described with a specificity that suggests clinical observation rather than folklore. A German physician writing in 1847, I found this reference in a footnote in a later survey of European botanical medicine, described treating patients of advanced age with wild strawberry preparations and observing what he called remarkable improvements in skin tone and locomotive capacity. He was skeptical himself. He did not know what to make of it, but he recorded it because he saw it. By 1900, those observations had largely disappeared from the medical literature, not replaced by contrary evidence, not disproven, not debated and dismissed, simply gone. And then there is the Marshall. Discovered in 1890, right at the height of our 80-year window, in the Pacific Northwest of America, the Marshall strawberry was not wild, but it carried something of the wild strawberry's character in an intensified form. By contemporary accounts, it produced fruit of such extraordinary complexity and depth of flavour that the commercial hybrids of the era tasted, by comparison, like imitations. It flourished, it was celebrated, and then, within decades, it was gone. Wiped out, the official record tells us, by a virus. Perhaps that's exactly what happened. But I keep returning to the timing. 1890, the height of the park removal programs, the height of the pharmaceutical transition. A strawberry of unusual potency appears, is briefly celebrated, and then disappears. I'm not connecting dots that aren't there. I'm asking why there are so many dots and why they all cluster in the same 80 years. The deeper I went, the more I found that the disappearance of this knowledge is not a story of science overturning superstition. It looks, in the documentary record, more like a story of science simply deciding not to look. Here's what I keep coming back to. The wild strawberry did not disappear entirely. It survived, as weeds tend to, in the margins, in the less managed corners of old parks, in the verges of country roads, in gardens where someone's grandmother planted it and no one ever pulled it out. And in those places, there are people, not scientists, not academics, just people who will tell you things about it, the sound, to the modern ear, like superstition. An 87-year-old woman I spoke with in rural Slovenia, and I want to be careful not to over-romanticize this because I'm aware of how it sounds, told me that her grandmother had given her wild strawberry leaf tea every summer of her childhood, and that she had been told it was for keeping the blood young. She said this matter-of-factly, with no drama, the way you'd describe a vitamin. Her grandmother had learned it from her grandmother, an unbroken chain of transmission, stretching back to a time before the removal. In certain villages, in the Carpathian mountain region, in areas where, it's worth noting, the great urban park management programs had less reach, the use of wild strawberry in preparations associated with longevity and what locals call blood renewal has never entirely stopped. The knowledge didn't disappear there because the parks weren't manicured, the journals weren't read, and the decisions made in Vienna and London never quite arrived. The evidence suggests something much larger was almost lost. And in some places, almost by accident, it wasn't. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. I want to be honest about the limits of what I can claim. I cannot prove intent. I cannot prove coordination. I cannot name the people who, if such a program existed as a deliberate program, would have made these decisions. The documentary record I've found is fragmentary, and fragmentary evidence is exactly what you'd expect to find if you were looking for something that someone was careful not to document. That last sentence is worth sitting with, because it's a problem that cuts both ways. The absence of evidence can mean there's nothing there. Nothing was hidden because nothing happened, but absence of evidence can also mean the removal was thorough. How do you tell the difference? I've been wrestling with that question for 3 years and I don't have a clean answer. What I can say is this: the pattern of simultaneous adoption, the absence of a recorded decision-making process, the specific targeting of this plant in city after city, the concurrent disappearance of the medical literature that described it with such specificity, the brief appearance and sudden extinction of the Marshall strawberry at precisely the wrong moment in history, and the survival of the knowledge only in the margins, in the places the program didn't quite reach, all of this taken together describes something. I don't know exactly what, but it describes something. And here's the question that keeps me up at night. If there was a body of empirical knowledge accumulated over centuries across multiple continents, knowledge that the Greeks codified, that medieval physicians refined, that stonemasons carved into the doorways of cathedrals so that even the illiterate could not miss it, knowledge about a plant that appeared to do something remarkable to human physiology, and if that knowledge was, whether by design or by the blunt force of modernization, systematically retired from the places where ordinary people could access it, then what exactly did we lose? I started this investigation looking for something specific, and I ended it looking at something I can't quite name. The wild strawberry, Fragaria vesca, a plant so common that we walk past it without seeing it, a plant that, for most of recorded human history across most of the world, was treated as something considerably more than a weed. A plant that the Greeks and Romans wrote about with clinical precision. A plant that medieval stonemasons considered sacred enough to carve into the stone of cathedrals, where it would outlast empires. A plant that was, within a specific and well-documented 80-year window, systematically removed from the places where urban populations would most naturally have encountered it. Was there a plan? Was their knowledge being protected or suppressed or simply lost in the turbulence of modernization? Was the removal of the wild strawberry from city parks merely an aesthetic decision by well-meaning urban planners who couldn't have known what they were erasing? Or is it possible, I'm only asking, I'm not claiming, is it possible that embedded in the bureaucratic language of 19th century park management documents, in the footnotes of German physicians and the letters of American landscape architects, in the folk traditions of Slovenian grandmothers and Carpathian villages, in the carved stone of 1,000 cathedral doorways, there is the outline of something that was known and then somehow wasn't? The deeper I went, the more I found that the history we're taught is not always the history that happened, not in the sense of dramatic suppression, not in the sense of villains and conspiracies, but in a quieter, more mundane and perhaps more troubling sense, the sense that knowledge can disappear, not because anyone destroys it, but because the institutions that transmit knowledge decide, generation by generation, what is worth transmitting. The wild strawberry is still out there, growing in the margins, in the verges and the unmown corners, and the old stone walls. It's been waiting. The question is whether we still know how to look.